Hey church, hopefully you're all keeping safe and well. It's great to join with you online again as we continue our June and July series, Eyes on Jesus. And today we'll be looking at Mark chapter 10, and specifically the events of verses 32 to 45, for which I've been given the title today, Jesus the Suffering Servant. So what better place for us to start than by turning to the Bible? So let's turn to Mark chapter 10 and verses 32 to 45. Mark 10, verses 32 to 45 from the NLT. They were now on the way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were filled with awe, and the people following behind were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen to him. "Listen," he said, "we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him. But after 3 days he will rise again." Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do us a favour." "What is your request?" he asked. And they replied, "When you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in the places of honour next to you, one on your right and the other on your left." But Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering that I am about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism of suffering that I must be baptized with?" "Oh yes," they replied, "we're able." Then Jesus told them, "You will indeed drink from my bitter cup and be baptized with my baptism of suffering, but I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. God has prepared those places for the ones that he has chosen." When the 10 other disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. So Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be the slave to everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Now, as we look at the passage here in Mark 10, it quickly becomes clear to us that there are two distinct sets of characters within the events taking place. On the one hand, we've got the disciples. They're not quite getting what Jesus is saying to them, even though he's telling them exactly what is about to happen in the coming days. They're not really paying attention. They're too caught up in their own lives. Then, on the other side of things, we find Jesus, who's fully focused on living out God's plan for his life. Now, as we all sit here watching today, we'll find ourselves all in completely different points in our faith journey. For some of us, we may be only right at the very beginning of that journey. Perhaps the strange events of the past few months have left us with questions and seeking God for the answers to those. Or possibly, for some other of us, this is a journey we've been on for a number of years, perhaps even a number of decades. But no matter where we find ourselves in our journey with God, or how we would rate our relationship with Jesus, if we're completely honest, we've probably at one time or another all found ourselves in that disciple camp, not really understanding exactly what it is that God is saying to us. And then, maybe at other times, we've been fortunate enough to find ourselves in the Jesus camp, where we're able to fully focus on God's will for our lives, regardless of what's going on around us. Perhaps, if we're really honest, we can all probably remember times when we've moved between the two within what seems like a matter of moments. Mark 8 to 10 is a really powerful part of the Bible when it comes to Jesus teaching the disciples and us today about how to live lives for God. And in particular, we see that amazing verse at the end of our passage, which I guess you could say, in our kind of corporate speak today, would be Jesus' mission statement, the real core of the good news of the Bible. As we see Jesus teaching so clearly what is required for us to live lives in line with God's plan, it can be hard for us to understand how the disciples didn't seem to get it. But then, if we look at ourselves, I'm sure it wouldn't take too long for each of us to think back to a time when we've been in exactly that position, the same position as James and John in chapter 10, where perhaps we failed to understand exactly what it is that God is saying to us. If we were able to ask them today, I'm pretty sure that James, John and the other disciples would love the opportunity to have verses 34 to 41 edited out of that Bible. It doesn't exactly paint them in the best light. Jesus has literally just finished explaining what is about to happen to him. And if you look back over the earlier chapters of Mark, you'll see that it's the third time he's done this. And it seems as though James and John have only been partially listening. They've heard him mention something or other about a new kingdom, and they want to make sure that whenever this new kingdom comes, they'll have the important jobs. Jesus is just finished telling the disciples about the torture and suffering that he's about to go through. And James and John's first instinct is to try and make sure that whenever this happens, things will be all right for them. And perhaps, if we're brutally honest, we can relate this to our own lives. Maybe the extent of our own relationship with Jesus is that we come to him when we're in need of a favour, or perhaps we've been faithfully serving God for a long time and we'd like to cash in some of that hard work for a little reward. I guess, in some respects, you could almost forgive the disciples for not understanding what Jesus is teaching them. The things that he's describing are completely the opposite of everything in the world around them. And for us today, it's probably the same. The world around us is telling us that something completely different is important. If we flick back a couple of pages to Mark chapter 8, we see that Jesus is teaching the disciples. And this is the point when Peter finally works out that Jesus is the Messiah. He doesn't fully understand, but he's starting to get it. Now, we're in a fortunate position today that when we hear the term Messiah, instantly we relate that back to Jesus. But for the disciples, as they were trying to grasp exactly who Jesus was and what he was teaching them, the term Messiah probably conjured up a very different image. Perhaps for them, the Messiah would be some sort of powerful king who would banish their enemies with military force, or a power that they'd never seen before. If we fast forward again to chapter 10, and we find Jesus telling his disciples about how different his kingdom will be, while James, John and the other disciples are thinking of Jesus' kingdom in an earthly sense, and trying to make sure that they have the important roles as part of that kingdom, Jesus is telling them that things are going to be very different from now on. As I say, we can't really blame them for not understanding fully, even though this is the third time that Jesus has told them what is going to happen. Yes, they might be slow learners and a little bit self-absorbed, but what Jesus is teaching them is so radically different to anything they would have ever experienced before in an earthly sense. Jesus is saying he won't be a leader like our lovely orange friend from across the ocean or our very own bumbling Boris, who choose to flaunt their authority and put their own comfort ahead of those they're leading. Jesus is taking a different approach to leadership. He's going to lead by example, to serve the people he's come to lead, even to the point of giving up his life as a ransom for theirs. Now, while Mark highlights the disciples not understanding what Jesus is teaching them as a negative example to us, this also helps to highlight Jesus' example to us as an alternative way to live. Now, whilst most of the world is encouraging us to chase fame or fortune, status and the newest and best of everything, Jesus is telling and showing both the disciples and us today that God has a different plan for his followers. We are called, like Jesus, to be different. And now I'm sure that's what drew so many of the crowds to Jesus. Yes, there may have been one or two, maybe a few, who'd heard about the miracles he was doing and wanted to see them like some sort of magic show. But for many, they would have heard that there was something different about this guy that they couldn't not see for themselves. And Jesus here was telling the disciples that the world may give status based on power, the size of an army, or the number of people who are under you. But God is calling them to live, and us today, by a different standard. For status, what is important to God is not how many serve you, but how you serve others, how you put others first. Are we prepared to make that sacrifice to live this way? And this is what he's asking to James and John when he says, can you drink the cup or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? He's asking if they're really, truly willing to suffer in the same way that he suffered. And how about us? Maybe we're not called to give up our lives, but are we willing to live with this calling that Jesus gives to us? To set aside our own agendas, our own plans, our hopes and dreams to follow the path that Jesus did and that God has set out for us. But Jesus isn't just a great example for us. Yes, we're called to live lives that follow the example of Jesus, embracing servanthood sacrificing our own desires for the benefit of others, and in everything pointing them towards God. But Jesus was so much more than just a great example for us in how to live our lives, as we see with that amazing, powerful ending to this passage in verse 45, which sums up so amazingly everything that Jesus was about. Jesus doesn't just give us a great example to follow as we live out our lives here on earth. He also gives us the power to do everything that we do. If we were to try and emulate Jesus in our own strength, it would be an exhausting, thankless task that we were destined to fail. After all, as we remember in Romans 3, everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. So there's no way on our own that we would be able to meet God's standard. Even the most holy of us would require more than a little divine intervention. And we can look at the disciples as an example. There's nothing about them from a worldly perspective that marks them out as remarkable in the slightest. They're young men from a rural area. They're not very well educated. And as we see that from their time with Jesus, they aren't exactly the quickest at picking things up. If you were recruiting for a job role, I doubt they'd be very high up on the candidate list. But despite their shortcomings, the disciples were able to do remarkable things in the name of Jesus. They told people about Jesus fearlessly, and some even ended up giving up their lives in sharing the good news with those people. It can't have been anything about them from a worldly perspective that qualified them and made this possible. But as Mark 10 demonstrates, in the fact that Jesus is having to tell them the same thing for a third time because they just don't get it. And what an encouragement this can be to us, both in the fact that Jesus didn't give up on them because they didn't get it immediately, and also the fact itself that they didn't have to get it right first time. Even if we've messed things up, God can still use us in amazing ways for his glory, just as he did with the disciples. And all throughout Acts we see those amazing things taking place. It wasn't the disciples' worldly credentials that enabled them to do amazing things for God. It was Jesus' sacrifice, as we see in verse 45. For even the Son of Man came, not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many. God wasn't operating like a special agent on some American TV show who decides not to negotiate with the terrorists. He sent his Son to earth to give his life as a ransom, to buy us back from our inevitable failure and the suffering that this is destined to bring us. Jesus' life wasn't just that great example for how we should live our lives. Yes, he is that, but he's also, as I say, so much more. He paid the price that we couldn't pay and lived a life obedient to God that we couldn't live, so that we could be free. And Paul tells us in Romans 6 that we have been set free from sin, not because of anything we have done, but because Jesus was willing to sacrifice himself in our place, to be that suffering servant. And it comes down to this: God is good, and we're not good enough. But Jesus has been good enough in our place. So now, because of all this, we too can be seen as good by God. Jesus' obedience to God's plan and sacrifice on the cross is what gives us the power to do amazing things in his name, just as the disciples did. It turns living for God from that hopeless, impossible, rule-following task into a liberating life where we can experience true freedom. We, just as Jesus did, may experience difficulties and times of suffering in our lives, but we're able to endure these times, again, just as Jesus did, because we can rest safe in the knowledge that that ransom has been paid, and because the Son has set us free, we are now free indeed.